All right, well, we're kicking off our Christmas series. How many of you, again, love Christmas? Yeah? Yes, there are definitely a few of you that love Christmas. How many of you enjoy Christmas songs? Raise your hand. All right, there's some Scrooges in the room, too, that I see. We're not going to call you out. You called yourself out. But hey, we're going to sing songs like Joy to the World. I've got a little ornament that I've hung up on my tree. It says, Be Merry. This is a season that we marked with joy and merriment. But here's a strange and odd reality. Some of us right now are going through difficulty and hardship. We may sing the song, Joy to the World, but this season feels anything but joyful. Some of us at night find ourselves in tears, feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed out. I mean, how can we genuinely sing Joy to the World and talk about being merry and bright when it feels so broken and so messed up? As odd as this sounds, this Christmas series is on suffering. Here's why. No one's immune. I don't care what your race is. I don't care what your social status is, how much you make. I don't care what your job or profession is. Every single person in here, we will suffer. We will experience hardships. We will go through trials. And so in a season where we're saying joy to the world, how do we reconcile with what we are experiencing in real life? Hardship. We live in a culture that has an inability to reconcile the two thoughts. I mean, think about culture when it comes to pain and suffering. We do everything in our power to isolate ourselves or insulate ourselves from pain. If you go home today and you have a fever or you don't feel well, what's the first place you're going? The cabinet, right? To the medicine cabinet. You want to take something so you don't feel it. Now, it's not inherently wrong to do that, so don't misunderstand me. But that's just a picture of how we treat suffering. We do not want to suffer, and we stand in all of history as a culture that, again, most isolates and insulates ourselves from suffering. And I've noticed this. We have an inability when we experience raw pain, raw emotion, an inability to process it in a healthy way. I read some doctor this past week, and he goes, I've traveled all over the world. I've been in India, and I found that it is Americans who struggle with pain tolerance and the processing of suffering more than anywhere else in the world. And I'd say not just anywhere else in the world, but for all of time. When you think about the suffering that has happened to different people groups throughout the history of the world, again, we're sitting in a pretty good place, but we fail to understand how to rightly deal with suffering. And so what we want to do in this series is we want to help you understand what we're experiencing, suffering, and yet what we're singing, joy. These two ideas that seem and appear to be in conflict of each other, joy and suffering, we want to reconcile those. Because what's really interesting and fascinating about the Bible is the Bible actually reconciles those ideas for us. It has a completely different perspective on pain and suffering. The Bible doesn't teach that we are to isolate and insulate ourselves from pain. It doesn't teach that. It has a completely and profoundly different view of pain and suffering. So here's what I want to do today. Today is all about your perspective, my perspective of pain. I want to kind of reset our perspective of when we go through difficult times, what is happening, how do we view it, how do we understand it, how do we process it. So we're going to go to the book of James, which is found in the New Testament. Now, if you know anything about James, James was the younger and half-brother of Jesus. James was there or around there when his older brother started to say that he's the Messiah. He was there when Jesus was persecuted and killed. He was around. He got to experience that. Then James became a leader in the church in Jerusalem. After Jesus' death, after his ascension, he was there in Jerusalem leading the charge, telling people about Jesus. And during that time, persecution broke out. During that time, James was there and led the church when people were experiencing hardship because of their faith. So James, he's a fellow sufferer. James is somebody that if you're going through pain right now or hardship, you can look at James in the eye and he can say, me too. I know what it feels like. I know what pain and hurt feels like. I know what tears feel like at night. I know, me too. Now, he's going to write to a people group that are also experiencing pain and suffering. James chapter 1, verse 1 says this, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Now, this is a really important phrase. Whenever we read the Bible or read a book in the Bible, we always say this. You have to understand who's the author, who are they writing to, and what's the point and the purpose of the book. So we know that James, the half-brother of Jesus, the younger half-brother, is writing the book, and he's writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, what in the world does that mean? 12 tribes, that's an Old Testament reference. So if you go back and read the Old Testament, the nation of Israel was considered the 12 tribes of Israel. Essentially, the 12 tribes means the people of God, and they are in the dispersion. Now, what in the world is that? Well, like it sounds, they were dispersed throughout the Roman and Greek area of that time. When persecution broke out in the church, they were scattered. They left Jerusalem, their homeland, and they were dispersed throughout the Roman colonies and the Greek countries. They have left their home. So James, a fellow sufferer, is writing to a people who have left their home, left their families, their careers. They know what it's like to start anew in a brand new city and not having their loved ones around, not having a job, experiencing persecution because of their faith. So James, a sufferer, is writing to those who have suffered. Now, what in the world do you think is the first topic he's going to deal with? Suffering. The very first topic that James is going to deal with and address is suffering. Why? He suffered, and he knows they are suffering. This is what he says, verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Now just pause for a moment. For James, it's not a matter of if, but when. When you experience difficulties in life, when you experience hardship in life, when you experience times that are just marked with suffering, he says, I want you to count that joy, all joy. Now, you and I are sure to suffer for two primary reasons. And this is really important for us to understand. I've already said this, none of us are immune to suffering. Every single one of us will suffer in different ways, at varying degrees, but we are all fellow sufferers. Nobody's immune to it. We've all experienced pain and tears in this life. But we're sure to suffer for two reasons. First, sin has infected everything in our world. If you go back to the beginning of the Bible, we read that God, he made this world, and he looked at it and says, that's good, and that's good, and that's good. And he got to the very end and goes, this is all very, very good. He told Adam and Eve, as those that are going to have like rule and dominion over this world, I'm going to encourage you to follow me. I'm going to give you a decision to follow me or not to follow me. But if you don't follow me, if you go your own way and rebel, here's what's going to happen. Death will enter into the world. In other words, if you run from me, if you rebel from me, sin, death, suffering, that will enter into your life, into your experience. And of course, we know the story in Genesis chapter 3. They ran from God. They rebelled from God. Sin entered into the world. Death entered into the world. Suffering entered into the world. So here we sit, right? And we are experiencing the effects of that. That we live in a broken world. That we live in a world that's not fully right. There's an oughtness to our soul. That we know that things aren't as they ought to be, as C.S. Lewis says. He looks around the world and he goes, hey, those natural disasters, that ought not to be. Those dysfunctional relationships, that ought not to be. Kids who are neglected or abused, that ought not to be. There's an oughtness in our soul that things are not as they ought to be. And the Bible gives a full explanation of this is because sin has entered into the world. And because sin has entered into the world, we are all going to experience the results and the consequences of that. So here we sit, we're experiencing the consequences of sin. I'd also say that suffering is a unique part of the Christian experience. So if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, guess what? Suffering is a part of the Christian life. It just is. Jesus said really radical things like, if they hated me, then they're going to hate you. If they're going to persecute our leader, our Savior, then we as his followers can experience a world that's going to push back against us, correct? Paul writes to a young protege. So Paul wrote a lot of the New Testament. He's got this young kind of protege pastor, and he's teaching him a lot about life and ministry. And this is what he tells Timothy. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Not may be persecuted, will be persecuted. So if you want to live a life that honors God, that's all in with Jesus, guess what's going to happen? You're going to experience pushback from the world because there's two clashing value systems that happens whenever we live for Jesus. We live for the kingdom of light, and the kingdom of darkness wants to push back. If you truly follow Jesus, you will experience that pushback. It may be in your family. It may be in your workplace. Maybe in your neighborhood, your friendship circles. I don't know how that looks. We just know this. All who desire to live a godly life will experience some kind of persecution. It's a part of the Christian life. Now, there's this heretical teaching that's mainly, I would say, in the church here in the U.S. And here's how this teaching goes. If you follow Jesus, nothing bad will happen in your life. You'll make more money than you ever made before. You'll be healthier than you've ever been. Your relationships will be perfect and seamless. You won't experience a breakup of marriage. This is taught within the church. And it's heretical because we know that if we are truly going to live for Jesus, that we will experience hardship. We live in a broken world, so we will experience hardship. See, God often doesn't change our circumstances. He changes us in the midst of our circumstances. See, God, he's not looking to change sometimes the hardship we're going through, but change us in the midst of the hardship we are experiencing. So Jesus himself, he says in John 16:33, 33, he preps his disciples, and this is what he says. I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, or literally trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus prepped his disciples before he left them saying, it's going to be difficult. There's going to be trying times in your life. So to follow Jesus doesn't mean we get to check out of hardship and suffering. No, we go through the exact same thing that those around us go through, and even to a greater extent as we call ourselves Christians and follow God. So it's not a matter of if for James, but when you go through that. He says, when you go through difficult times, I want you to count it. That literally means regard it as, consider it as all joy. Now, notice what James does not say. James does not say, I want you to put a fake face on. I want you, when you go through difficult times, act like everything is perfect and there's nothing wrong. That's how I want you to act. He does not say that. The Bible actually teaches that when you go through difficult times, it's healthy to grieve. Jesus, when he lost a dear friend to death, what does he do? He grieves. He weeps over the loss of his friend. You can go back to the Old Testament, the book of Lamentations, and it is a book on grief. The Psalms, there's cries in which the psalmists are saying, God, where are you? What's going on? I am in big trouble here. I need you. There's real grief and heartache. The Bible never asks you to not grieve. So please don't misunderstand what count it means. What it means is there's this declaration now and once and for all that I'm going to change my perspective on suffering. My perspective of suffering is going to completely and radically change. I'm going to grieve deeply when I lose a loved one, when I'm battling disease or cancer, When relationships go awry, I'm going to grieve over them, and it's good and right. But there's going to be something in my soul, an underlying joy. He says, count it all joy. It literally means undiluted joy. It's not mixed with anything else. It's joy. Let me explain the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is completely circumstantial, right? Happiness, if you're a kid in the room, happiness is Christmas Day, Christmas morning, right? You've been waiting for that gift. You've been waiting for that whatever, PlayStation 4, this gaming console, or this toy. You've been waiting for it for so long, and that day you get to open it up, and that feeling you have inside, kids, that is called happiness. Now, those of us that have experienced that as kids, and as we grow older, we realize how tied to circumstances that is. Because kids in 3 to 6 months from now, you may not even play with that anymore. The shininess wears off, the newness wears off, the happiness of that moment begins to wear off. Now, for us as adults, like happiness is like going on that really great vacation. And there's nothing wrong with experiencing happiness. But we have to understand the limitations of happiness. That happiness is what? Circumstantial. It's situational. It's got an asterisk by it. Anytime you experience happiness, there's an asterisk by it. And the asterisk says, hey, this is just temporary. It will wear off at some point in the future. Just know that. But joy is not circumstantial. Joy is not dependent on what's happening in life. It's this deep-seated sense of well-being, of confidence in the Lord. And it doesn't matter what you go through, it's still there. It never goes away. It's always right there. You may go through grieving, you may go through hardship or suffering, but that joy that the Lord puts inside of us, that sense of well-being, even in the midst of chaos, it does not go away. James, he's writing as a sufferer, not just in theory, he's experienced suffering, to a bunch of people suffering. And he goes, count it all joy, consider it, change your perspective. It's all joy when you go through various kinds of trials. Now, we're all going through various kinds of trials. What you are going through is not the same as what I'm going through, or the person beside you. Even when a family experiences loss or grief, you know, we all grieve and handle it completely different. So he's saying it doesn't matter what you're going through. The Bible teaches that there's 3 kinds of suffering. This is really important. 3 kinds of suffering that you and I can go through. The first is deserved suffering. This is a kind of suffering that we have done something and we are meeting the consequences of that. The Bible says things like, you'll reap whatever you have sown. So just like a farmer goes out and he sows certain kinds of seed, guess what grows up? What has been sown. If you sow an orange tree, you're not going to get apples, right? You reap what you sow. So sometimes our suffering is attached to the decisions that we've made. We've all made decisions that have negative consequences in our life. So this is the spouse that commits adultery. There are ramifications and consequences to that, right? This is a person that chooses to drink for many, many, many years, and it has a toll and effect on their body. So what you sow is what you reap. That's deserved suffering. Some of us are suffering right now because we've made a decision and we're walking through the consequences of that decision. Now, we can experience innocent suffering as well. Innocent suffering is when I'm going through something, but I didn't choose to go through it. It wasn't a bad decision that I made. This could be a natural disaster. A hurricane comes through Florida and tears up neighborhoods and homes and people's lives. Certainly the results of the fall, but they didn't directly choose that. This is a child that experiences neglect or abuse by a caregiver. This is because of your race, you're treated differently. Because of your ethnicity, people treat you differently. You didn't choose to have that skin color, and yet here you are. That's innocent suffering. So sometimes we are going through things that we just did not choose to go through. And the Bible, of course, teaches righteous suffering. Righteous suffering means I've chosen to follow Jesus, and I'm feeling the effects of that from family members, coworkers, friends. They're at odds with my decision to follow Jesus. I'm being persecuted at some level because of that. So I don't know what you're going through, but I know that James says it doesn't matter what kind of trial you're going through, various kinds, we're to consider it and change our perspective and count it all joy. Now, here's where we struggle. How in the world can we count it all joy when we go through pain? I understand what you're saying, James, and I understand you've been through a lot. I understand that you've experienced suffering just like I have, but how or why can we count it all joy? Well, he begins to answer that in verses 3 and 4. He starts to answer the why part of this. Listen to what he says. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The overarching principle here is that God leverages troubles for good. God will leverage the mess of our life for both his glory and our good. He says things like, it's going to test your faith. Whenever you go through difficult times, it's going to really test the genuineness of your faith. I know you say you follow Jesus, but you want to know where the rubber meets the road is go through pain, hardship, and suffering. And it's in those moments, what you're truly clinging to and trusting in and putting your confidence in, it's revealed. It's brought up to the surface. I think for the church in America, there's many people that claim to follow Jesus, but they go through difficulties and troubles in their life, and they realize it was a very superficial faith. And there were not deep roots in their heart. They were not truly clinging to Jesus himself. He was a nice idea, but they were clinging to something else. So he goes, it will prove your faith. What you truly, it will validate your faith, whatever you're trusting in when you go through trials. And if it's truly faith in Jesus, guess what it's going to produce? It's going to produce steadfastness. This could also be translated endurance, perseverance. That when we go through trials and we go through suffering, if we truly cling to Jesus, it teaches us things that comfort and ease just can't teach. All the way back in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 8, God had brought the nation of Israel out of slavery. They had cried out. They were experiencing pain and suffering. And so they cry out to God. They do the only thing they know what to do, so they cry out to God, and he brings them to the promised land. But he gives them a really clear warning and a caution in Deuteronomy 8. He goes, here's what's going to be your propensity. You're gonna have this propensity to forget about me when life is comfortable and easy. When you build your homes, when your crops are growing, and you have an overabundance and your stomach's full, and your flocks and your herds are multiplying, and you have gold and silver, it's all multiplying, like things are going really, really well in your life. I mean, so well that you forget about me. There's certainly something in our heart that neglects God when we go through seasons of comfort and ease. And James says, and what God does is when we go through the opposite of that, when we go through trials, when we go through suffering, when we go through pain, you know what begins to happen? Is we begin to depend on God even more. C.S. Lewis, he says this, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. See, when we go through things, the genuineness of our faith is revealed. We actually get to see who we truly are. where we're clinging to, and good can come from it. Suffering can teach us to cling to our King in a way we never have before. Do you also see how hardship provides opportunity? I mean, think about things that we really value. Ideas like forgiveness, courage, self-sacrifice, compassion, overcoming temptation. You know, none of that is available in a perfect world. So what God does is he leverages the brokenness of this world to reveal his glory. See, if you and I didn't rebel and run from God, well, then we wouldn't have the backdrop provided in which God could show his loving kindness, forgiveness, grace, and mercy. How about this? You see someone in need, meaning somebody's going through hardship. You have an opportunity to show compassion. The American mind, we don't understand that suffering could actually be leveraged for something good. And so again, we insulate, we isolate ourselves, and we want nothing to do with it. But it is in moments of suffering and pain and hardship that you know what God does? He chisels away the things in our life that just don't matter. You know, the famous artist Michelangelo, he has this wonderful sculpture of David. And he made it out of marble. And somebody asked him one time, like, how in the world did you do this with just a giant block of marble? Like, how in the world did you make such a magnificent and brilliant sculpture? He goes, oh, David was always in there. I just had to chisel away the excess. In suffering, that's what the Lord does in his grace and his mercy. He chisels away what we don't need. So ultimately, he's maturing us. He's providing opportunity for us to experience that which we wouldn't otherwise. You see how God is leveraging troubles and trials for good? His glory, he gets all the credit. We're like, goodness, God, this couldn't have happened without you. And you did it for my good. So what do we do with this? If you're going through pain and hardship in this Christmas season, what do you do with it? Well, the first is you count it all joy. You change your perspective. The big so what? You count it all joy. You go, you know what, God, right now, I may not fully understand it, but I'm not going to try to escape from it. I'm not going to try to insulate myself from it. I'm not just going to sweep this suffering and this pain under the rug. I'm going to look in the mirror and I'm going to have to deal with this because, God, you're doing something. Hey, some of you need to hear this. God hasn't left you. It feels like he's left you, and he hasn't left you. He doesn't leave you at your bed at night, and he doesn't leave you when you wake in the morning. He is right there. He hasn't abandoned you. And he is using the brokenness and the mess that's going on right now for his glory and your good. The Bible says he works all things out for the good of those who love Christ Jesus. All things. Not some things, all things. Second, after you change your perspective and you go, God's doing something here. He's not left me. He's doing something good here. Next, you would ask for wisdom. I want to read to you the next verse. It says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives it generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. Wait. I've heard this verse before. If you lack wisdom, just ask God for it. But I've never heard the true context of this. He's talking about suffering. You know one of the first questions you and I ask when we go through something? Why? Like, why, God? Why are you doing this? How could you allow this to happen? So James goes, when you're going through difficult times, it's okay to ask God those questions. He's big enough for your questions. But there's a genuine sense of like, God, I want to see what you're doing. God, you know everything. You have complete knowledge. God, please show me what you're doing right here, right now. And it says he grants it. He grants wisdom. He does it generously. So if you're going through difficult times right now, have you asked God for wisdom in the midst of your circumstances? Sometimes he won't change the circumstances, but he'll change you in the midst of those circumstances. And last, believe. I want to finish off verse 6, 7. It says, but let him ask in faith. Ask for wisdom and faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. For my anniversary this past year, I thought we should do something crazy. And so initially I bought one ticket to jump out of a plane. That was just for Heather. I just want to see how she was going to respond to that if I just bought one. And I said, you keep playing. And then I said, no, I should buy two because I don't want her to think I'm pushing her out of a plane. And so we both went skydiving. And it's really crazy. As you're standing up looking, like I think it was like 24,000 feet down. It doesn't even make any sense. How you're so like wishy-washy. I'm like, I want to do it. I'm like, no, I don't want to do it. I want to do it. Like, no. And of course, you're attached to somebody if you've never done it before, and they just have to like push you out because you're so wavy. When we ask God for wisdom in the midst of our trials, he says, but believe. But believe. Like he's doing something. He hasn't left you, hasn't abandoned you. Don't be wishy-washy. Don't say, I want to do it, I don't want it. No, he's saying, no, just believe. Just believe that I am doing something that is beyond your comprehension. It is for my glory and your good. I want to end with this. Jesus, he helped us reconcile joy and suffering, and this changes our perspective. It says this in Hebrews 12:2. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus endured the cross. That word endured, steadfastness. He endured it because he saw the joy of the Lord. He saw what God was doing. He trusted the Father's plan. I want to encourage you, if Jesus did that, then so can we. For the joy that's set before us, we can walk through whatever we need to walk through today in faith and in wisdom.